Good evening. I don't have all the answers, just to start with that. Cities are a very complex topic. We've heard a lot of complexity, even just at the microscopic scale today, when it's talking about materials, etc. But I'll try and give you an overview of what we think is happening, what we think some of the problems are, and where hopefully cities might be moving in the future. And if we can start with the slides. There we go. Next slide, thank you. So I think one of the problems with cities is ultimately the scale that we're dealing with, right? And the speed of change. In Europe, most of our cities, we're looking out the windows, this has developed over 2,000 years, right? A lot of our cities in Europe grew over equally long periods of time. This is Shanghai in 1992 and about 30 years later. Over the course of the time, entire China has added 600 million people to the urban population. That's the size of Europe in about 30 years, right? So the change in these cities is happening at such a pace that unfortunately some things people get right, other things people might get wrong, right? I think, and the challenge we've got today is that particularly in countries that are growing rapidly, that are urbanizing rapidly, a lot of the mistakes that we've made in the West get built into pieces of infrastructure and will be paying the price for those for decades to come. Ultimately, it's about making decisions and making choices of how we want to live and how we want to exist on this planet. It's the choices we all make in terms of how we live, how we work, the cities that we choose as our homes. And this is from a piece of research that just shows the dramatic differences in the land take that is predicted for the urban areas. And this ultimately is all lands that would be sealed and cut off and no longer available to provide, to balance the heat island stress, to provide food, to absorb the rainwater, etc. So there's a real question of how much our cities need to grow into the future and how much we're able to contain and constrain them. But we can't talk about cities without talking about the people that live in them, right? Cities are places of opportunities. People move to cities. I've moved to cities for romantic opportunities, for professional opportunities, and many other people have done the same, and many people will continue to do that for millennia to come. It's important that we keep in mind that these are new generations with different expectations, different views of the world, different attitudes. We heard earlier about changing attitudes towards mobility, for instance, and in some ways it's great to be talking to an alumni of a university, because I think education is incredibly important because you're training the next generation of decision makers and city leaders. When we look at the sustainability of cities, this is sort of a very easy way of summing up what is going on. The yellow and the orange make up for about 55% of the carbon that's emitted in cities. And this is all by buildings. So these are the homes we live in, the offices we work in, the museums we visit. The green pie over there, about 25% is mobility. And what I'd like to do in the next 10 minutes is just focus on those two pieces and unpack a little bit what is going on. So firstly, we'll focus on buildings. And again, this is just a subset of what ultimately is an enormously complex topic. Starting with building materials. One of the challenges we have in the real world, unlike the metaverses, is gravity, right? Things have to stand up. Traditionally, we've used concrete that we see around us, beautifully cast by an architectural, designed by the architectural company from Switzerland, but ultimately, historically, this was a very safe way of doing buildings. Engineered timber is a material that's moving in more and more rapidly, but it requires adaptation both in terms of perception, in terms of risks, but also legal adaptation in terms of insurances and so on and so forth. We're looking at new materials that are less carbon intensive than concrete, which is not the most sustainable material, unfortunately. And then there's lots of research going on. We heard about hemp just now. There's materials that are being grown literally as fungi. And I think it's an incredibly exciting space. I think the adaptation, again, the adaptation cycle is difficult because, particularly when it comes to structural elements, we want to know that these buildings will stand for years to come and not collapse on us. But definitely an interesting aspect. Just to stay with materials for a moment, if you're looking at the windows again, you see beautiful, elegant window frames. Next slide, please. Historically, these components are incredibly complicated, and they fulfill very complicated functions in terms of insulation and keeping the water out and so forth. which also makes them very difficult to recycle, right? Because you've got a lump of stuff that you can't take apart. And again, we heard about that earlier today. And I think there's a lot of movement at the moment that is happening in industry. I think that we're very keen on to really look at these elements and see what components of these elements can be recycled, what components can be reused, and how ultimately can we minimize the amount that ultimately has to be discarded when the windows have to be replaced. Some examples from our work. This is a project we've done in Copenhagen, also just to rethink how we use materials. It doesn't always have to be brand new. We've used reconstituted concrete, for instance, to cast the floor. We've used old window frames to class the lifts in the lobby. So I think it's also just the attitude of that we all bring to the projects of thinking how we can use materials and reuse materials in an innovative way. And lastly, to stay with the materials for one more slide, it's the intelligence and again technology, what it helps us to do with materials. We talk about materials passports, so that every piece of material in a building, we know what its contents are in terms of the physical properties, or we know what the chemical properties are. And using what we call building information management systems, every building we design these days, we know how many kilograms of every single material is contained in those buildings, and that information allows us both to calculate very accurately how much carbon is embodied in these buildings, but it also gives a snapshot of everything that has gone in and everything that will come out of a building and how it could be reused in the future. And if we do that on a city scale, it could look something like this. This is from a university in Denmark that looked at the content of materials across the urban scale. So taking together all these pieces of information from individual buildings and summing up where are the buildings in the city at the moment, and this ultimately could become a material bank for the future, right? If I don't need a window here anymore, I could give it to somewhere else. So again, I think we're not quite there yet, but I think there definitely starts to be an interest in thinking about how we don't buy the light fittings, for instance, but we buy a service to a light fittings and they're provided by a service provider. Now, rather than building from scratch, the best thing obviously is to try and reuse buildings that already exist. And this is an old factory building in Madrid that we had the opportunity to develop. Before I show you what it looks like afterwards, I just want to talk about the challenge of energy rating systems that we face as an industry. There's different systems. Some are national, others are international. You might have heard of LEED or BREEAM, etc. They have different rating categories: silver, gold, platinum, etc. You might have seen a plaque at an entrance of an office building or so. The problem we've got is that even with the most luxurious rating system, the platinum, we're going to end up with a 3-degree increase in temperature, which is twice as much as was agreed in Paris. So it's not good enough, right? So ultimately, the sad truth is that the current regulations, even though they're very stringent, are not going to get us to where we need to get to. So we as an organization are very keen to try and work as hard as possible with our clients, and it's easier with some than with others. I think that's the reality. But we're trying to work as hard as possible to get down to that green line. The other problem we've got also is that a lot of these rating systems look at the top half of this iceberg, right? It's the operational energy. And there's a lot of embodied energy in these buildings. Again, I've mentioned the concrete already that's surrounding us today. So we really need to look at the entirety of this iceberg to understand what is the real impact of a building on the city, on the environment. This is a quick animation we've done early on, sort of to try and understand what is the impact of the different options, right? So if we rebuild the building, the same floor area our client was after, we end up with 12.5 tons of carbon per square meter. Or if we build if you reuse the existing building but build a much smaller extension, we can save about 25% of the carbon. And this is what the client agreed to, which is brilliant. And it's interesting that we see a lot of clients, institutional clients, who really think about the future and want to avoid stranded assets that they can't sell in the future, And they're much more open-minded to really think about how we can, how much carbon is in those buildings and how we can minimize that. So we dropped the building, we had a small underground extension, and just as some examples, we were able to obviously reuse the brick that's being restored. We had a new timber structure which had sequestered carbon, and then we reused the trusses in the roof, which again were able to save materials and use this already there. What we've done in the background to enable these calculations is what we call the life cycle carbon analysis. So we don't look just at the construction or just the operation, we look at the whole life cycle, right? And what's interesting also, that includes, for instance, the way of how people get to a building, which has an enormous impact, right? If you take the same building and stick it on top of a tube station, and if you take the same building and stick it in a location that you could only drive to over the lifespan of a building of 50, 60 years, that energy that's being spent to get people driving to that out-of-town location has an enormous impact on the overall life cycle of the building. And here the promised images of what it looked like afterwards. And I think we can both be able to retain some of the history and the character, but also create a space which is welcoming and hopefully works for the client. And this is on site at the moment. The other topic we heard about today is movement, and I just want to touch on that very briefly, less from a technology point of view, but more to talk about why we are moving in the first place. I get very excited about land use maps. Not everybody does, but they tell a story of a city really well, right? So we're somewhere here at the moment. You can see central London. This is the city. This is Westminster. In red, we have the offices. In pink, we have the predominantly leisure and retail areas. And then in yellow, all around it are the residential places. So within that map, we have embedded a lot of the movement that's happening every morning and every evening on the doorsteps of our buildings. When we look at how people are distributed across these cities, then this map tells that story. So again, in red, we show the high density of employment, and in blue, we show the high density of where the residents live. And London has a very distinct pattern where we have one big blob of red in the middle. There's a little red blob over here in Canary Wharf, which are the towers on the other side through that window there. But ultimately, we have a very concentrated allocation of the commercial land uses, and then people live predominantly in relatively low-density terrace houses all around it. We have about 6.1 million jobs in London. 25% of those jobs are within this tiny area, and within this tiny area, the ratio of residents to jobs is 7:1, right? So we have 7 times more jobs than residents just within those two, within the core area of Westminster and the City of London.
That might be changing, might it? As of the last 2 years.
Yes.
That concentration might ease
absolutely,
up a bit.
absolutely. And I think that's a very good point, because I think one of the historic assets we've got in London are the high streets. So these are our commercial streets. There we go. And so these are where I'm showing in black here. These are traditionally the neighborhood centers, the clusters where people would go and do their daily shopping. There's about 1,200 of them, and a staggering 90% of Londoners live within a 10-minute walk of their high street, right? So I think London has a very resilient structure from that point of view. But the reality is that because of the pressure of the sort of hyper-centrality, particularly around retail, a lot of those high streets have suffered, and a lot of the retail has gone, a lot of that money has gone into the centre. I think what the last 2 years showed was a resurgence of those spaces. So this is sort of what we had before the pandemic, and hopefully now as people rediscover these local centres, this will get better. You might have heard of the 15-minute city. I'm always slightly cynical when people talk about it, because the reality is it's not really a new concept. I think before we had the car, every city was a 15-minute city, right? Because you needed to have your daily needs within a walking distance, right? But it's great that policymakers and planners start talking again about the needs to have a mix of functions, a mix of use, a mix of amenities within walking distance of people's homes. when we're moving around on those lines, this is the road network again of London. Next one. What we'll find, and this is true for most European cities, about 65% of the space is given over to cars, and about 35% is given over to pedestrians. Again, if you imagine your usual road section, that sort of feels probably about right. The interesting thing is that the capacity of those systems, the road system and the pedestrian system, is very unbalanced. As the next chart shows, if I'm taking a 3.5 meter wide lane and I'm sending cars down that lane, I get about 2,000 people down that road over the course of an hour. This is sort of one car after the other. If I were to send buses down that street with fully loaded buses, it's about 5,000 people. Bus rapid transit system is something that, particularly in Latin America and developing countries, is very popular because it's an efficient way of running the equivalent of a metro, but on a dedicated route above ground rather than building very, very expensive tunnels. Even more capacity. But the most efficient way is just to let people walk. Right? Factor 8, cars to pedestrians. And walking and cycling really is also not just efficient, but also very healthy, right? Statistics from TfL, if all Londoners walked or cycled 20 minutes a day, this would save 1.7 billion in the NHS treatment costs over 25 years. So a lot of non-communicable diseases can be heavily reduced through walking and cycling, and just 20 minutes a day, right? So a little bit of walking is a good thing. Now, we need the infrastructure to be able to do that, and this is just a couple of examples of some of the work we've been doing. The first one is sort of a speculative project from a few years ago where we were looking at introducing sky cycles, so cycle tracks above mainline roads, railway roads in London that will allow dramatically to increase the capacity for cycling, and obviously because these mainline routes sort of feed radially out into the outer suburbs would be very efficient in terms of connecting to a large number of residents. But London also has invested in other forms of public transport. Luckily, the Elizabeth line opened with a few years of delay and slight cost overruns, and we were lucky enough to design one of the stations in the Canary Wharf. And again, I think it's important that whenever we design station and infrastructure design, that we really celebrate these spaces. And in the case of Canary Wharf, which is not the greenest space, we were able to put a beautiful garden on top of the tube station, which really sort of becomes a place where the workers can go and have a sandwich away from their air-conditioned, cooled boxes. And the last project set on mobility is from Sluizen. So this is a project that started about 10 years ago, and hopefully the end date is by 2025. This is in Stockholm, and you can see it's a rather complex junction of mostly road ways with a couple of public spaces, but sort of, again, bounded by roads. And what we've done working over many, many years with the city and the New Zealand government is to really try and sort of unpack that junction, rethink about how much of the space do we want to give to the car, and how much space goes to the pedestrians, and then sort of reinvented how this space works from ground up. But ultimately, with all these projects, one really needs a long breath, right? So this will have been sort of 20 years in the making almost. As I said, a number of public administrations, but hopefully by 2025 we'll see it finished. So again, this is on site. And then the last topic, just to talk about, is sort of the healthy city, the healthy living. We already talked about the relationship between the movement and health, and this is another sort of statistics that really impressed me, right? So cars owners are 2 to 3 times less likely to get 20 minutes of activity per day. And as we heard before as well, nearly 50% of vehicle trips in London could be cycled in 10 minutes. So I think a lot is just about perception and attitudes that we need to shift and change, and hopefully the future generations will be slightly less addicted to the cars than we are. London has been very much leading in this space and developed a healthy streets framework, which looks at 10 indicators to ultimately make these spaces, these streets, safer and more comfortable. I think we need to get people both out of the cars but also onto the streets out of free will. And I think making the streets safer and more comfortable is critical. When you look at the demographics of cyclists in London, we still have the problem that it's predominantly male and sort of 20 to 45-year-old. And I think if you're looking at cyclists in Copenhagen or so, you get a completely mix of people who cycle. And I think a lot of work has to be done still on the cycle infrastructure, providing more cycle infrastructure, providing safer cycle infrastructure to get a better mix of the society onto these bikes. A lot of things in city move incredibly slowly. However, the pandemic really has shown how change is possible, and change from Burma to Berlin and many other cities happened within weeks or months for projects that usually would take years to fulfill. And I think this was a really exciting moment for all of us because we felt that actually you can take a parking space away on a street in New York and put a restaurant there, and everybody's happy. The world doesn't come to a standstill, the city is still there, right? So I think it really helped to shift the perception of a lot of people in cities across the world. Now, this happened more recently. In the past, we had similar lessons. In between 1800 and 1850, London grew quite rapidly, and not in the best or most organized way, so we had a lot of slums. This in turn led to unsanitary conditions, and cholera took hold, and a lot of people died. And the belief at the time was that it's the foul air that's causing that's the vector of transmission. And while this medically was incorrect, what it led to ultimately were a series of parks being built in London, and places like Victoria Park today are a testament of those times where city leaders realized we can change our cities, and we can provide spaces and breathing spaces for our citizens.
Yeah.
This is the park where I sort of on a Sunday morning I managed to go for a run. And just to round up on that one, again, enormous cost benefits to citizens and health benefits to citizens in London from those open spaces. We're lucky in London that we're in a very, very green city. So this is the same map as before. I'm just highlighting all the private gardens and the parks. The reality is a bit more complicated because only some of it is actually public, and it's about 880 square kilometers of green and open space. 36% of that is residential, and a quarter of that is public. But it's still a considerable amount of space and a very important piece of infrastructure for all of us in London. We had the opportunity to take some of that thinking to a project that we've recently, that I've been working on for a while, and which is going on site at the moment in Athens. So this is the old airport site where the Olympics were partly hosted, and we were able to introduce a 2 million square meter park that will be built in the coming years and will become a feature, hopefully, for all the people living around it. It includes a public beach as well as the park element.
Bruno, can I stop a second?
Yeah.
I'm going to give you one question. We're going to have to wrap, right?
Yep.
But I've taken a bit of a summary of what you said and a question for you. And it lines up a little bit with what I was asking Robert earlier about the grand infrastructure and investment, 100 trillion. I know, and it goes, there seems to be no end to the ingenuity of what you've found and discovered and uncovered. To hit some of these targets globally, quickly, how best can we share some of the things you're learning in one city and make it happen in 100 cities really quickly? Because everything seems to be about speed, and it can't just be a linear progression, can it?
Yeah.
What's your view on that?
It's a really difficult one because cities inherently move very, very slowly. And again, I think the pandemic showed that there are moments where we can move. I think the reality is that it's less about, we know where we need to go to, right? We need to walk more, we need to cycle more, we need to create more parks and open spaces, less impervious surfaces, for the rain to be absorbed, to manage the heat down effect, etc.
Whoa.
I hope that was the champagne.
That sounded good.
Yes, exactly. So I think the challenge, we know what the answers are, right? I think the challenge is to change the mindset of people. We can't go there without giving up a little bit of parking space, a little bit of road space, making compromises on how we travel around. I picked up cycling to work rather than relying on public transport, because ultimately faster in a city like London. So it's in everybody's hands, right? To elect the people you think will make the difference.
Right. It might seem a flippant comment, but I hope not. It struck me your slide about the iceberg, the things that are in our hands that we need to do well. Need that slide in 2030 for us all to recognise what an iceberg is, right? Because it might date quite quickly. Right, so this is our last speaker. Bruno, it's been fantastic. Thank you very much, Bruno. Right?